In 1938, Winston Churchill was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. He owed £18,000 to his stockbrokers, a sum equivalent to roughly £750,000 today, and he could not pay it. His beloved country estate, Chartwell, a sprawling manor in Kent that had become the very symbol of his identity, was listed for sale in the Times of London. His political career was in tatters. He had no cabinet position, no ministerial salary, and no realistic prospect of returning to power. He was 63 years old, overweight, drinking heavily, and being openly mocked in Parliament as a warmonger and a relic. And then, within days, a single financial intervention from an Austrian-born banker in the City of London wiped his debts clean, pulled Chartwell off the market, and freed Churchill to continue the very political campaign that would, within 2 years, place him inside 10 Downing Street at the most consequential moment in modern history. That banker's name was Sir Henry Strakosch. And the arrangement between these two men, documented in the Churchill Archives at Cambridge, notarized, signed, and quietly buried for decades, raises questions that most histories of the Second World War simply refuse to ask. Not because the answers are necessarily sinister, but because they complicate the mythology. They force us to confront a possibility that makes people deeply uncomfortable, and that is the possibility that the man who saved Western civilization from fascism might not have been in any position to do so without the quiet, strategic patronage of private money operating well outside the bounds of democratic accountability. This is not conspiracy. The checks were real, the letters are real, the archives are open, and the story they tell is one of the most extraordinary intersections of personal debt, political ambition, financial rescue, and global consequence that the 20th century ever produced. So let's start at the beginning. Not in 1938, but much earlier, because Churchill's financial chaos did not appear out of nowhere. It was a lifelong condition, as chronic and as dangerous as any illness, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything that came after. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on the 30th of November, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. His grandfather was the 7th Duke of Marlborough. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was the daughter of a New York financier. On paper, this was aristocratic wealth. In reality, it was aristocratic spending without the income to sustain it. Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, was a younger son with a modest inheritance. Jenny's father, Leonard Jerome, had tangled finances and left very little to his descendants. Both of Winston's parents lived far beyond their means. Jenny in particular was notorious for her extravagance, running up enormous debts on clothing, entertaining, and social appearances. She spent with the confidence of a woman who believed the bills were someone else's problem, and in many ways, they eventually became Winston's. Churchill entered adulthood without any serious capital. He had a famous name, an elite education, and essentially nothing in the bank. What he did have, from a remarkably young age, was an almost supernatural ability to earn money with his pen and his voice. He became a war correspondent in his 20s, covering conflicts in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa, and turning those adventures into books that sold well. By the time he entered Parliament in 1900, he was already earning substantial sums from journalism and publishing. But here is the critical pattern that would define his entire financial life. No matter how much Churchill earned, he spent more. He lived as if wealth were a birthright rather than something that required management. Servants, fine wines, cigars, lavish entertaining, expensive travel, a country house he could not afford to maintain. The gap between what came in and what went out was constant, and it was always filled by borrowing, delaying payments, or asking someone wealthy for help. This became especially dangerous after he purchased Chartwell in 1922. The property itself cost £5,000, a manageable sum. But Churchill's vision for it was anything but modest. He wanted larger bedrooms, new bathrooms, a modern kitchen, a library, a grand study, and rooms for entertaining. The renovation costs spiraled out of control. Contractors sent threatening letters. Payments were delayed for months. According to David Lough, the author of the definitive financial biography of Churchill titled No More Champagne, the Chartwell modernization became an ongoing financial hemorrhage that lasted years. Now, to pay for all of this, Churchill wrote furiously, by 1940, he had produced more than 25 books and over 225 articles. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most prolific and highest-paid writers in the English-speaking world. But even this prodigious output could not keep pace with his spending. He gambled heavily at casinos and rarely won. He speculated in currencies and stocks with the recklessness of someone who fundamentally did not understand markets. And in October of 1929, his financial recklessness collided head-on with the greatest financial disaster of the 20th century. Churchill had arrived in New York earlier that month, traveling with his son, Randolph, his brother Jack, and Jack's son, John. His old friend Bernard Baruch, one of Wall Street's most legendary investors, had arranged the trip. Baruch paid for Churchill's suite at the Plaza Hotel, covered his cigars and brandy, and introduced him to the cream of American finance. Churchill was intoxicated, not just by the alcohol, but by the atmosphere. He described stock exchanges in every hotel lobby, ticker tapes running all day, a nation seemingly printing money from thin air. He was, in his own words, swept up in stock market fever. In a single week, Churchill traded more than £400,000 on the American share market, a staggering sum for a man who had overdrawn his bank account and was already behind on his British tax payments. And then the crash came. On Black Monday, the 28th of October, 1929, the Dow Jones fell 13% in a single day. Churchill was a guest of honor at a dinner that evening at Baruch's Fifth Avenue mansion. The host proposed a toast to, quote, friends and former millionaires. The next day, Black Tuesday, the Dow fell another 12%. Over 2 trading days, $30 billion in market value simply evaporated. Churchill always told friends his losses amounted to $50,000, which in today's money is roughly $750,000. But according to Loff, this was only part of the story. His total exposure was far larger, and it was only because Baruch himself felt partially responsible, having connected Churchill with the brokers who facilitated the trades, that some of the damage was absorbed. Baruch paid Churchill $7,200 in compensation for losses incurred through his brokerage firm. It was a generous gesture, but it did not come close to solving the problem. Churchill returned to England financially wounded, and the timing could not have been worse because his political career was simultaneously collapsing. In 1929, the Conservative government fell, and Churchill lost his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The following year, he resigned from the Conservative shadow cabinet over a disagreement about Indian self-governance, a move that alienated him from his own party's leadership. By the early 1930s, Churchill was a political outcast. He had no ministerial post, no cabinet influence, and no prospect of either. The press referred to this period as his wilderness years, and it was an apt description. He was isolated, discredited, and sinking deeper into debt with every passing month. And yet, during this very period of personal and political humiliation, Churchill began the campaign that would define his legacy. From Chartwell, he started warning anyone who would listen about the growing threat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. He demanded rearmament. He attacked the policy of appeasement. He thundered in Parliament that Britain was sleepwalking into catastrophe, and almost no one in power wanted to hear it. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his successor Neville Chamberlain were committed to avoiding another European war at almost any cost. The British public, traumatized by the carnage of the First World War, overwhelmingly supported them. Churchill's warnings were dismissed as warmongering, as the ravings of a man desperate to remain relevant. In the corridors of Westminster, he was treated not as a prophet, but as a nuisance, a relic of a more bellicose era who simply could not accept that the world had moved on. But Churchill was not entirely alone. And this is where the story takes a turn that most conventional histories gloss over or ignore entirely. In 1936, a group of individuals held a private meeting at the Savoy Hotel in London. What emerged from that meeting was an organization called the Focus in Defense of Freedom and Peace, known informally as the Focus Group. Its stated purpose was to oppose the appeasement of Nazi Germany and to advocate for British rearmament and collective security. On the surface, this sounded like any number of political pressure groups operating in 1930s Britain. But the Focus was different in 2 critical respects. First, it operated largely behind the scenes. Churchill himself made no mention of the Focus in his wartime memoirs. Its existence was not publicly disclosed until 1963, when one of its financial backers, a German-born businessman named Eugen Speer, published a short book about its history. Second, the Focus provided Churchill with something he desperately needed, a platform and a source of funding during the years when his political influence was at its lowest point. As Speer himself wrote, and I am paraphrasing here, it was easy in later years to forget the role the Focus played in creating a platform for Winston Churchill at a time when he was in the political wilderness. Churchill was reportedly so concerned about the Focus's story becoming public that he personally asked Speer not to publish his account during Churchill's lifetime. Now, the Focus was not a shadowy conspiracy. It held public events, including a large rally at the Albert Hall. It included members of Parliament from multiple parties, trade unionists, journalists, academics, and business figures. The historian Richard Cockett, in his book Twilight of Truth, describes the Focus's connections to senior civil servants in the Foreign Office who were privately alarmed by appeasement. It was, in many ways, a legitimate cross-party advocacy group. But funding matters. And the funding of the Focus came from a relatively small number of wealthy individuals, several of whom had strong personal reasons to oppose Nazi Germany. Speer himself was a wealthy Jewish emigrant from Germany. Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, another major fundraiser for the group, was a prominent Jewish industrialist. The Board of Deputies of British Jews created a fund to support anti-Nazi organizations, and some of that money flowed to entities connected with the Focus. According to some accounts, the Jewish Defense Fund donated £50,000 to support the group's activities. This was a significant sum, equivalent to several million pounds today. None of this, on its own, is scandalous. Jewish communities in Britain had every reason in the world to oppose Hitler, and funding political advocacy against a regime that was openly persecuting their co-religionists was not only understandable, but morally admirable. The question is not whether the funding was justified. The question is what effect it had on the man who became its primary political vehicle. Because here is where the personal and the political collide in the most dramatic way imaginable. By early 1938, Churchill's financial situation had deteriorated to a genuine crisis. The recession in global markets had hammered his remaining investments. His journalism income was declining as European outlets, intimidated or occupied by the Nazis, stopped commissioning his work. His debts to Vickers da Costa, his London stockbrokers, had ballooned to £18,000, and the brokers were demanding payment. Churchill could not pay. He put Chartwell on the market. An announcement appeared in the Times. And then, within days, the crisis evaporated. Churchill's political disciple, a man named Brendan Bracken, who would later become his Minister of Information during the war, intervened. Bracken approached Sir Henry Strakosch, an Austrian-born banker and mining magnate based in the City of London. Strakosch was chairman of Union Corporation, one of the largest gold mining companies in the British Empire, and a member of the Council of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He was also, crucially, a man who had been supplying Churchill with confidential figures on German arms expenditure for several years, data that Churchill used to devastating effect in his parliamentary speeches demanding rearmament. Strakosch agreed to take over Churchill's entire stock portfolio, assume all existing debts and losses, and manage the investments for 3 years at his own risk. The exact amount of the initial intervention was £18,162, 1 shilling and 10 pence, paid directly to Vickers da Costa. In a letter preserved in the Churchill Archives, Strakosch wrote, and I am paraphrasing closely from the documented record, "My dear Winston, as agreed between us, I shall carry this position for 3 years, you giving me full discretion to sell or vary the holdings at any time, but on the understanding that you incur no further liability." Churchill received the letter and immediately withdrew Chartwell from sale. The Times had already announced the listing. Now it was off the market. The financial crisis that had threatened to end his political career was simply gone. But this was not the end of Strakosch's generosity. When Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, he again faced severe financial pressure. Strakosch stepped in once more. And when Strakosch died in 1943, his will included a bequest of £20,000 to Churchill, which in effect forgave whatever remained of the earlier arrangement. Over the course of their relationship, Strakosch's total financial support for Churchill ran well into the tens of thousands of pounds, an amount that translates into millions in today's money. Now here is what makes this story so uncomfortable for the conventional narrative of the Second World War. The Spectator, a respected British magazine, published an article examining the Strakosch arrangement and noted that if modern parliamentary standards had existed in 1938, Churchill would have had an extremely difficult time explaining the transaction to any standards committee. The journalist Andrew Roberts, in the Spectator piece, pointed out that the cheque to Vickers da Costa, the confidential agreement, and the subsequent bequest would have taken some explaining. Roberts also noted that only what he called ex-historians of the extremist kind had used Strakosch's Jewish heritage to claim that Churchill was somehow the hired help of an anti-Nazi lobby. But he acknowledged that one can only guess what today's press would make of the deal. And there is another layer to this story that is even more provocative. When German forces overran Czechoslovakia in 1939, they discovered documents in Prague suggesting that the Czech government had been channeling approximately £2,000 per year to members of the focus group around the time of the Munich Agreement in 1938. The Czech government, facing existential threat from Hitler's territorial ambitions, had an obvious strategic interest in supporting British politicians who opposed appeasement. Churchill was, by far, the most prominent and vocal of those politicians. Now, this is speculation territory, and it needs to be labeled as such clearly. There is no publicly available evidence that Churchill personally received Czech government funds. The documents discovered by the Germans referred to payments to focus members broadly, not to Churchill individually. And the source of the discovery, the Nazi occupation government, had every reason in the world to discredit Churchill and his anti-appeasement allies. But the mere existence of these documents, combined with the documented Strakosch payments and the focus group's fundraising activities, creates a picture that is far more complicated than the simple hero narrative that most of us grew up with. Let me be very clear about something here. Nothing in this story suggests that Churchill was wrong about Hitler. He was, by any reasonable historical assessment, spectacularly right. His warnings about Nazi Germany were vindicated by events in a way that made his critics look foolish at best and criminally negligent at worst. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which Neville Chamberlain surrendered the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a promise of peace, was precisely the kind of catastrophic blunder Churchill had been predicting for years. When Chamberlain returned to London waving his piece of paper and declaring peace for our time, Churchill rose in the House of Commons and delivered one of the most devastating rebukes in parliamentary history. He called the agreement a total and unmitigated defeat. He warned that there could never be friendship between the British democracy and the Nazi power. He predicted, correctly, that Hitler would not stop at the Sudetenland, that Czechoslovakia would be consumed entirely, and that war was coming whether Britain wanted it or not. Within 6 months, Hitler proved Churchill right by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. 6 months after that, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began on the 1st of September 1939. Chamberlain, who had staked his entire political legacy on appeasement, struggled on as Prime Minister for 8 more months before the disastrous Norway campaign of April. 1940 finally destroyed his credibility. He resigned in May, and Winston Churchill, the man who had been dismissed as a warmonger, the man who had been financially rescued from ruin barely 2 years earlier, walked into 10 Downing Street as the leader of a nation at war. And here's the question that lingers over all of this. Would any of it have happened without the money? If Strakosch had not stepped in, if the Focus had not provided a platform, if Churchill had been forced to sell Chartwell and retreat into total political obscurity, what then? Who would have led Britain in 1940? Chamberlain was dying of cancer. Lord Halifax, the other serious candidate for the premiership, was an appeaser who had privately advocated for a negotiated peace with Hitler. The possibility that Britain might have sought terms with Nazi Germany in the summer of 1940, a possibility that many serious historians consider genuine, was averted in large part because one man, Churchill, had the political standing and the personal authority to insist on fighting. And that standing existed in no small part because private money had kept him afloat during the years when his own financial recklessness should have destroyed him. Let me take you deeper into the mechanics of how Churchill's spending actually worked during this period, because it reveals something important about the man and about the system that sustained him. During the 1930s, Churchill maintained a household staff of approximately 8 servants at Chartwell. He employed a full-time secretary, a research assistant, and at various times a literary agent and a financial advisor. He drank prodigiously. According to Loft's research, in 1949 alone, Churchill consumed more than 1,000 bottles of champagne and 250 bottles of brandy. While the 1930s figures are not as precisely documented, there's every reason to believe his consumption was similarly heroic throughout the decade. He continued to gamble at casinos, usually losing. He continued to trade in currencies and stocks, usually losing. He played the financial markets the way he played polo, which is to say with enormous enthusiasm and very little discipline. When his investments went up, he spent the gains immediately. When they went down, he borrowed to cover the losses and then continued spending as if nothing had happened. This was not the behavior of a man who understood money. This was the behavior of a man who believed, on some fundamental level, that the universe would provide, and who had the social connections to ensure that it usually did. And this brings us to a broader point about how power actually works, not in theory, but in practice. Churchill was not unique in being financially supported by wealthy patrons. Throughout British political history, and indeed throughout the political history of most democracies, wealthy individuals and interest groups have funded politicians whose views aligned with their own. The practice was common in the 1930s, and it operated in a regulatory environment that was, by modern standards, essentially non-existent. There were no requirements to disclose financial interests. There were no standards committees reviewing private arrangements between members of Parliament and their benefactors. The entire system operated on the assumption that gentlemen could be trusted to act honorably, an assumption that was, to put it charitably, frequently tested. What makes the Churchill case so extraordinary is not the existence of financial patronage. It is the scale of the consequences. This was not a backbencher being funded to promote a trade association's interests. This was a man who would become the wartime leader of one of the world's great powers, a man whose decisions would shape the lives of hundreds of millions of people, being kept financially solvent by a small network of private individuals who had their own reasons, however legitimate, for wanting Britain to take a harder line against Nazi Germany. The conventional narrative treats Churchill's financial difficulties as a colorful footnote, an amusing character detail about a great man who was bad with money. But the documents suggest something more significant. They suggest that at the precise moment when Churchill's political campaign against appeasement was reaching its climax, his ability to continue that campaign was entirely dependent on external financial support. Without Strakosch's intervention in 1938, Churchill would have been bankrupt. A bankrupt member of Parliament would have been forced to resign his seat. A man without a seat in Parliament could not have led the opposition to Munich. A man who did not lead the opposition to Munich would almost certainly not have been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty when war broke out in 1939. and a man who was not First Lord of the Admiralty would not have been the obvious candidate to replace Chamberlain in 1940. The chain of causation is not speculative, it is documented. Every link in it can be traced through letters, financial records, and political archives. And what it reveals is a reality that is both more complex and more unsettling than the mythology. The savior of the free world was, at the critical moment, a debtor, and his creditors, whatever their motivations, were not acting out of charity alone. They were making a strategic investment in a political outcome. That the outcome happened to be the right one, that Churchill happened to be correct about Hitler, does not change the underlying dynamic. It simply makes it harder to talk about honestly. And there is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention. After the war, Churchill's financial situation was transformed. His fame, his brand, to use a modern term, was now worth more than anything he could have imagined during the wilderness years. His war memoirs alone earned him enormous sums. He received gifts and hospitality from wealthy admirers around the world. He was showered with honorary degrees, literary prizes, and speaking fees. The man who had been unable to pay his stockbroker in 1938 ended the war with the equivalent of roughly £4 million in his bank account. He had, in a sense, been vindicated not just politically, but financially. The investment that Strakosch and others made in keeping him afloat had paid off spectacularly for Churchill, for Britain, and for the world. But the story does not end with vindication. It ends with a question. And the question is this: if the fate of nations can turn on whether a single politician can pay his bills, if the difference between a negotiated surrender to fascism and the defiant stand that saved European democracy came down to an £18,000 cheque from a City of London banker, then what does that tell us about the systems we rely on to govern ourselves? What does it tell us about the relationship between money and power, between private wealth and public policy, between the individuals who write the checks and the leaders who cash them? Churchill himself seems to have understood the awkwardness of the situation. He never publicly acknowledged Strakosch's financial assistance. He never mentioned the focus in his memoirs. He asked Speer not to publish his account. The letters and agreements were filed away in archives that remained closed for decades. When files were finally declassified in the 2000s, the details emerged quietly, attracting attention from financial historians and Churchill specialists, but never quite breaking through into the mainstream narrative. And perhaps that is the most telling detail of all. Not that the arrangement existed, but that so many people, for so long, preferred not to look at it too closely. Because looking at it closely forces a reckoning with something uncomfortable about the way history actually works. The great man theory of history, the idea that exceptional individuals shape events through sheer force of will and character, is deeply appealing. It gives us heroes. It gives us stories that make sense. It gives us the comforting illusion that when the moment demands it, the right person will always appear. But the reality, as the Churchill Archives reveal, is messier than that. The right person did appear. But he appeared because a complex web of financial relationships, political calculations, personal loyalties, and strategic investments kept him standing at a moment when his own choices should have brought him down. He was brilliant, courageous, and profoundly right about the most important question of his era. He was also broke, reckless, and completely dependent on the generosity of others. Both things are true. And the real story, the one that the documents tell, is more interesting and more instructive than the myth. Because in the end, this is not just a story about Winston Churchill. It is a story about how power actually operates in the modern world. It is a story about the invisible architecture that supports the visible leaders, about the money that flows behind the speeches and the policies and the decisions that shape millions of lives. It is a story about what happens when the fate of civilization depends not on armies or alliances or grand strategies, but on whether one man's stockbroker gets paid on time. And if that thought makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. Because the same dynamics that kept Churchill in the game in 1938 are still operating today, in different forms with different names, but with the same fundamental logic. Money finds power. Power needs money. And the transaction between the two, however it is dressed up, is never quite as simple or as clean as anyone involved would like us to believe. Now, I want to make sure we approach this with the nuance it deserves. Calling this the transaction that started the Second World War is provocative, and intentionally so. The Second World War was started by Adolf Hitler's aggression, full stop. No financial arrangement in London caused Germany to invade Poland. But the question of whether the war would have been fought, whether Britain specifically would have chosen to fight rather than negotiate, is a different question entirely. And the answer to that question runs in part through a set of financial documents in a Cambridge archive that most people have never heard of. Churchill was not bought. That framing is too crude for what actually happened. But he was sustained. He was kept viable. He was given the financial oxygen that allowed his political career to survive long enough for history to prove him right. And the people who provided that oxygen had their own interests, their own fears, and their own vision of what Britain's relationship with Nazi Germany should look like. Whether you see that as a noble act of patronage or a troubling example of private money shaping public destiny probably depends on how you feel about the outcome. When the cause is right and the leader is great, we call it philanthropy. When the cause is questionable and the leader is flawed, we call it corruption. The mechanism is the same, only the moral judgment changes. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of this entire story. Not that Churchill was compromised, because the evidence does not support that conclusion. Not that his benefactors were manipulating him, because the evidence does not support that either. But that the line between legitimate support and undue influence is always thinner than we would like to believe. And that the people who walk that line, on both sides, rarely see it as clearly as historians do in hindsight. So the next time you see a statue of Churchill or hear his voice crackling through wartime recordings, remember the whole story. Remember the speeches? Yes. Remember the courage? Remember the bulldog spirit and the refusal to surrender. But also remember the £18,000. Remember the stockbrokers' demands and the Chartwell listing in the Times. Remember the quiet letter from a banker in the City of London, and the fact that without it, the voice that held civilization together might have been silenced before it ever reached the microphone. History is not made by great men alone. It is made by great men and the people who pay their bills. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And if you want to go even deeper into the hidden financial forces behind the major events of the 20th century, make sure to check out this video right here. I think you are going to love it. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.